Hello and welcome to today's lesson. We're going to be going over topics in the Study Island lesson called Domain and Range. And what I've done is I've pulled out different types of questions that you can do on this graphing calculator without having to use any or hardly paper and pencil. So this calculator is the TI-84 Plus, and this is the calculator that you are given on the screen on the Algebra 2 EOY. And these are also questions that are related to the Algebra 2 Standard 2.1D. As I'm going through these, it's always a good idea to write down the steps and take notes so that you can have that to go back through when you are studying them later. And you can even pause the video and you try the steps yourself as I'm going along to help put it into your memory on how to do these. Because a lot of these problems are a little bit different and you have to remember all the steps for each type of problem. But practice makes that easier. A little bit of information that you are going to need to know to be able to answer these problems is just the difference between a bracket with corners and a parenthesis that is curved. So if it has the brackets, that means that number is included in your answer. So that would be like a less than, equal to, or greater than or equal to. And if it's a curved, then that is just less than or just greater than. It does not include 0. So this here would include 0, and it would include 20, and it would include every number in between. Here's another way to think of it. So like I said, you're going to use the bracket with corners for greater than or equal to or less than or equal to. And then you are going to use the parentheses with no corners to show that it does not include that, or for infinity. So here, if you were trying to write x is greater than or equal to 6 with an interval notation, so with the brackets, you can have 6, so that would be in the bracket, but infinity would get the parenthesis. And then this is saying from 6 through infinity, so 6 and up. Whereas if you're just looking at greater than 6, answers greater than 6, you do not include 6. So now it gets the parenthesis, the smooth parenthesis, through infinity, which always gets the smooth parenthesis. So you can go ahead and pause right now if you want to and look at these other examples, and when it's appropriate to use the parenthesis and when it's appropriate to use the bracket. So to answer the majority of these questions, I'm going to be using the table function on the calculator. So the first step is going to be to turn it on, and then I'm going to go to my y equals button, and I'm going to press that. And for y1, I'm going to put in what f of x equals. So I'm going to put in e, which above this ln in blue is e to the x. So I'm going to press second ln, and that gets me my e with the exponent. And in that exponent, I'm going to type parenthesis x minus 3 parenthesis. And then I'm going to over arrow to jump out of the exponent and minus 8. And now it's typed in, so I'm going to go and do second table to look at the tables. So here I'm looking at the x column because I'm looking at domain. Remember, domain is all x values, and I'm reminded of that because all of my answers here are talking about the values for x. So I want to look at, when I'm looking through the x's here, does it go less than -3? Are those the only x's I have value for? This r here stands for all real numbers, so that means I can have any real number for x. There's no limits. This is less than -8, and this is greater than -3. So that means on my x column here, I'm going to go to -3 and -8 and see if I see error over here in the y column. So I just use my arrow, and here at -3, I have numbers before and after it. So that's not going to be one of my answers. And when I go to -8, I have values for y before and after it. It's the same value, but it's still a value. So that means that because no matter where I scroll on this x column, I always have y values, That means it's going to be all real numbers. Choice B is going to be my final answer. Now, to define the domain of this function, I'm going to follow the same steps. I'm going to go into y equals, clear out my last question, and then type in the square root, which is above x squared, so I'm going to have to press second x squared to get the square root symbol to show up. And then underneath the square root, I'm going to have 13 minus x. And so now that what I have typed in the calculator is the same as what's in my problem, I'm going to press second table. And here, all of my answers either have to do with all numbers, so negative infinity to infinity is all numbers, or they're somewhere around 13. So that means I'm going to, in my x column, because I'm dealing with domain, I'm going to scroll until I see 13. And when I go beyond 13, it says error in the y column. So I have a value for 13, but not for anything greater than 13. So that means that my domain is not, I cannot have anything above 13, but I can have 13 and below. So that means less than or equal to 13 is going to be my domain, which is choice D. So now I'm finding the domain of this function, and you might be able to see it from the graph if you're familiar with how to find domain from a graph. So you might not need to do these steps, but if you need to, it's just the same steps. You're going to go to y equals and clear out the old functions, and then type in this function they have above the graph. So I'm going to type in parenthesis x minus 3 parenthesis, and then I'm going to use this caret button to make an exponent and press the 3. That's all I have in my exponent, so I'm going to use the right arrow to jump out of it, and then plus 1. So once what's on the calculator at y1 matches what's on your question, then you're going to press second table, and you're going to see the table for this function. So I'm going to look at my answers, and I see that the answers have to do with all numbers, or they have something to do with negative 3 or 1. So I'm going to scroll to negative 3 and 1 in my x column, because that's what is in, that's the domain. So I use the x column to find the domain. So 1 in my x column here, it has a value at 1, it has values before and after 1, so that means that's not going to be part of the restrictions on my domain. So now let's check out negative 3. And now when I get to negative 3, I once again have I don't have any restrictions because there's no errors at negative 3 or before or after it. So that means because negative 3 and 1 both check out, that letter A, all numbers between negative infinity and infinity, which means all real numbers, is going to be my answer. I can have any answer I want in the domain. In number 4, I have f of x is equal to the square root of x, and it gives me the graph. So if you're not sure how to tell the domain from the graph, you can go ahead and use the table on the graphing calculator. And as I look at my answers here, letter A here is saying that you can have 0 and 1, but you can't have any decimals or fractions between those. You can have 1 and 2, but you can't have any decimals between them. Whereas B is saying you can have any number greater than 0. C is saying you can have 0 or any number less than that. D is saying you can have 0 and any number bigger than that. So most of these have 0 in them, so that means when I go to look at my table over here, I'm going to look around 0 first. So my first step is to go to y equals and clear out y1 and put second square root x into the y1 equals, so that I'm looking at the table for that graph. And if I look at 0, I have a value, but all numbers less than 0 in the domain get an error for the y value. So that means that negative 1, negative 2, negative 3 are not in the domain. And any numbers between there, so like negative 1.5 is not in the domain either. So that means that 0 and greater have values. That means 0 and greater are in my domain. So that means I can have 0. through infinity. So the bracket with here with the corners tells me that I can include 0, which I want it to. So that means letter D here is going to be my final answer. Now these next couple of questions are going to look at the range, and the range is the y values. So my first step is still going to be the same. I'm going to put this equation into y1 in the y equals button. So I press y1 and then I just go ahead and clear that out and type in my new equation. So I'm going to have negative x squared plus 17. And then I'm going to go ahead and look at that table. So I'm going to do second table. But now I'm looking at the y column instead of the x column. So if I look at my answers, they all have 17 in them. So it means I'm going to be looking for a 17 in my y column. But take note, you can't scroll up and down in the y column. You still have to use the x column to scroll up and down. So at 0, I see that there's a 17 in my y column. And from there, I see that as I go greater than 17 or down the column, I see that those numbers are getting smaller. And they just keep going smaller, they get more and more negative. And as I go up from that 17 in the column, the same thing happens. All the numbers keep getting smaller and smaller than 17, and they get more negative and negative. I can't find a number greater than 17, but I do have 17. So that means my range is going to be 17 and all the numbers smaller than it. So that means I'm going to have less than or equal to 17 for my range, which is choice A. This next problem is following the same steps. I am looking for the range of this function. So I am going to put this function into y equals, so go ahead and clear out that old one. And to get absolute value, I'm going to have to press math, and then over to number, and then ABS here in the first choice stands for absolute value. So I'm going to press 1, or you can press enter, since 1 was highlighted, and I'm going to type in an X. And that's all that goes in the absolute value, so I'm going to right arrow out of it, and then I'm going to press minus 10. And now what I have in my question is now in the calculator, so I'm going to go ahead and press second table. And as I look at my answers here, it's looking at numbers in the range around 10, negative 10, and 0. And all of these either have a greater than or equal to or just a greater than there. So I'm looking for numbers that, I'm looking at the range to see if I have numbers that the range is greater than or equal to 10, greater than or equal to negative 10, greater than or equal to 0, or greater than 0. So first I'm going to look to see if I can find any of these numbers. So right away I can say, okay, it went to a negative 10. So I'm looking at negative 10, and if I look above it, the numbers are getting bigger as I go up the column. And as I look below negative 10, the numbers are getting bigger as I go down the column. So there's never any numbers that are smaller than negative 10. There's no negative 11, negative 20, nothing smaller than negative 10. So that means that my range, looking at the numbers in my y column for the range, is going to be negative 10 and numbers bigger than negative 10. So that means my final answer is going to be greater than or equal to negative 10, which is choice B. And then for this last question, we're looking for the range again, so that means we'll be looking in the y column. So I'm going to go ahead and put this equation into y1, so I'm going to do second square root. And under my square root, I have x minus 3, and that's it, so I right arrow out of it, and then do plus 1. And it looks, what's on the screen looks the same as what's in the calculator, so I'm going to press second table. And I can see right away, I can see some errors. So I'm going to scroll down here, and I notice that it starts at 1 in the y column, and the numbers are getting bigger. And they just keep getting bigger and bigger. And what I want to do is make sure that it doesn't plateau anywhere. So the other numbers in my answer are 3, 4, and 12. So I've already made it past 3, and I've made it past 4. And let's see if I also make it past 12. After lots of scrolling, I see that it does go beyond 12. So that means that my graph starts at 1 in the y column and gets bigger.